Let me ask you a question. When does a game need to be remade? Or maybe the bigger question is, do games need to be remade at all? I've always had this long list of games in the back of my mind that definitely needed to be remade. I didn't even think about it. It was just, were they good? Are they old? If yes, then of course they need to be remade. But that's sort of a dangerous way of looking at things, and I've come to realize that, because sometimes remakes can suck. They can be made with poor attention to detail, different creative forces behind resulting in something far different. They could be reinterpreted in ways that you didn't expect them to, and in the process, they could actually lose that certain something that made them feel special to begin with. I mean, for some examples of some failed remakes, let's take a look at Highlight on the original NES. That was a remake of a much older PC game that was revolutionary for its time, but it was released on the NES 5 years later in the States, well after the gaming scene had evolved well beyond where it was when it originally came out, and as a result, we remember the game very poorly. And that's just one game that just failed to be updated that made it seem like so much of a worse game when it was released here in the States. But Japan still views that game so fondly. Breath of Fire 2 is another really good example for the Game Boy Advance. The original game had a bit of a rough spot with the translation, and when ported over to the Game Boy Advance, Capcom failed to retranslate the game in any meaningful way, and as a result, the Game Boy Advance version is just as bad as the Super Nintendo version. And that ended up resulting in a fan retranslation, and fans ended up having to fix it on their own. But that's not what a remake is supposed to be. A remake can be so much bigger than all those things. I feel like a remake is a game developer's opportunity to smooth over the rougher parts of the game, and it's also an opportunity to make the game feel better and control better and play better to fit and be competitive in the current market in which the remake is being released. So with that in mind, there are some actually really good remakes out there. Persona 1 and 2 for PlayStation Portable, for instance, are some really good remakes, especially if you look at the difference between Persona 1 on PlayStation and Persona 1 on PlayStation Portable. The game was just completely revamped, and we actually ended up getting a whole other segment that was completely left out during the localization. Basically the other half of the game that we never got. And as for Persona 2 Innocent Sin, we actually never got that in the States, so this was an opportunity to bring over a game that we never got a chance to see. And if you compare Persona 2 Innocent Sin to the gameplay of Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, you'll see that they did a lot of streamlining with that game and overall made it feel like a much more fluid and newcomer-friendly experience, which is exactly what a remake ought to do. Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver are also examples of remakes done right. Originally they were released on the Game Boy, and you wouldn't even be able to tell if you looked at the Nintendo DS release of these games because they have incorporated updated visuals, and there's also various other gameplay quality of life improvements. It's just a much better experience overall that way. So what exactly makes a game ready for a remake in the first place? This is something that I've kind of been mulling over in the back of my mind for the last few weeks, and I think I've kind of come up with a few bits of criteria that really help in establishing what games are really good candidates for remakes. One of the first things that I like to consider is how accessible is that first game. That game, if it's rare or uncommon, or if it was never brought over to the United States, this is an opportunity to remake the game to make it more accessible to more viewers, or more players rather. So in thinking of games like that, I'm thinking games like Terranigma, for instance, would do well with some sort of re-release. Games like Earthbound would also do really well with that sort of remake or re-release. I like to think of games that also have unfinished business. Games that I feel like weren't able to really show all of their stuff, that weren't really able to stretch their legs, and when I think of games like that, I'm thinking of games like, believe it or not, Quest 64, which somebody paid a lot of love and care into that game, but they definitely ran out of money or time or both, and ended up putting something out that just wasn't really finished. And also on the same subject, Xenogears. I know a lot of people love it as it is right now, but that second disc is way different from the first, and it's because of poorly managed time and funds. And I feel like Xenogears would be so much better if it was given a chance to be fully realized once again. And then lastly, I think of games that have aged really poorly to the point where it's becoming a barrier for new players. And when I think of games like that, I think of games like Final Fantasy VII. Again, I know a lot of people love Final Fantasy VII exactly as it is, but it has aged pretty poorly with its very early 3D models and really primitive texturing. And as a result, a lot of people feel really nostalgic for it, but a lot of people who haven't played it or didn't play it when they were much younger find it kind of difficult to get into. Same with Wild Arms. Wild Arms is very pretty overall, except during the battles, which also feature that similar very early 3D modeling, which it's charming to some, but not everybody. So with these criteria in mind, I've got a small list of games that I think would be really cool candidates for being remade for today's consoles or handhelds. Starting with some Atlas games actually, Shin Megami Tensei 1, 2, and Shin Megami Tensei If. I feel like these three could be remade into maybe a collection by Atlas. The games were originally released on the Super Famicom, and there are some fan translations out there, but I feel like these would be really good candidates for being remade because Atlas tends to do a really good job of sticking true to their intellectual properties. Shin Megami Tensei 1, 2, and If would make a perfect compilation, especially since we've already gotten Shin Megami Tensei 3, 4, and I think 5 is on the way, and I'm kind of surprised Atlas hasn't already done it. Another game that I would nominate for remake, even though it's very unlikely to happen, is Legend of Dragoon, which has a pretty rabid fan base out there, and I'm one of them. The game hasn't really aged too poorly in my opinion, but it's hard to really play on modern displays. So I think that the game could stand to be remade, maybe using something that's a little more forgiving on the timing and make it a little more accessible to today's players. I feel like this would be a really good way to go for Sony, especially with RPGs kind of making a little bit of a comeback. I mentioned Xenogears earlier in the video, and I stand behind that 1000%. The game really deserves a chance to be fully realized to the creator's original designs, and I feel like that whole series that he had planned, we're kind of getting bits and pieces of it here, but if we could instead just get a full remake and fully envisioned version of Xenogears, that would be a really good start. These next two nominations are probably not going to be super popular for a lot of people, but I'm going to go ahead and nominate The Elder Scrolls Arena and Daggerfall because the games really just, they were never released on console, so they were never accessible to someone like me, and then if you go back and play them today, the control schemes are a little wonky if you're used to playing more modern styles of gameplay, which I'm assuming most of us are. I feel like the games would really benefit from being remade, but I understand that it'd be also an enormous undertaking. But maybe someday we'll get to see The Elder Scrolls, Daggerfall, and Arena fully realized with high-definition video graphics and modern style of gameplay, and if we do, maybe everyone will hate it. So maybe never mind, but I think it'd be really cool to see. I also mentioned Breath of Fire 2 earlier, and I still stand by that. Breath of Fire 2 did eventually get a fan translation that made it much, much better. But honestly, I would love to see Capcom revive the series as well as remake Breath of Fire 2. I feel like the fact that it's a relatively expensive Super Nintendo RPG at this point, and it has some rough points that could really stand to be, buffed out a little bit. I feel like this would be another perfect example of a game that's just ripe for the remaking. And then the last one that I'd like to throw in there is Mystical Ninja starring Goemon for the Nintendo 64, which had pretty poor camera controls, and it also had some stuff that didn't age really well, but it had a really solid foundation. Ganbare Goemon is a franchise that I feel like we were underserved here in the West, and Konami really did a disservice for us by doing that. So I think they could start by making it up to us by remaking Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. I feel like this is a really good way for us to get more Goemon and for Konami to get back on our good sides, actually. Maybe. It'd take a lot, but that'd be a good way to start at least. But let's be honest here, none of these are really likely to happen. These are just games that I think would be really good if done properly, assuming that they were done properly. Which, as we know, is a really, really big assumption. But what do you guys think? What would you like to see remade? Should games even be remade in the first place? Let me know down in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good day, everyone.